Good evening, YouTube. Pat Condell has come out with another video, and I suppose he deserves some congratulations for that video, for two reasons. Firstly, it's the first video he's done in a while where I haven't been able to post literally the same video as a response, and secondly, I think it's the one where he most insults the intelligence of his viewership. I'll go through vaguely in order to pick out some of the choicer tidbits. The first one that he brought up was that Sweden had changed its constitution without consulting the people. That's because the way the constitution is changed in Sweden is by two votes in the Riksdag, in the parliament, one either side of a general election. So Parliament voted for it, everybody knew that this was going to come up in the next Parliament, and didn't vote for anti-constitutional change parties, or set some up, or set up a platform or anything, and it was duly approved again. Indeed, the only party who voted against it was the National Democrats, of whom more later. So this thing about change the constitution without consulting the people is, well, technically accurate, because that's not how you change the constitution in Sweden. Next up is this thing about recognising multiculturalism, and isn't it awful how Sweden is bowing over and becoming dhimmis and doing everything to be accepting of Islam, except it's not about that. The languages of Sweden are Swedish, Älvdalian, Gutnish, Jämtlandic, Scanian, Finnish, Meänkieli and Sami. Those are just the major indigenous ones. And the interesting one there is Sami, which is divided into Northern Sami, Lula Sami, Southern Sami, and a few other dialects. You see, Sweden isn't all Swedish. Obviously there's groups, from Finland, not Finnish immigrants, but Finnish ethnic Finns living in Sweden. But the people of particular interest here, why it's important to recognise multiculturalism in Sweden, are the Sami, who have been screwed over by the Swedish state, historically. Their kids were sent to missionary schools and to state boarding schools. This is sort of not a million miles away from what was going on in Australia with the Aborigines. And you've got this systematic denial of the rights, of their rights to enjoy their traditional life, by making it impossible for them to live their life as they want, restricting access to forestry and hunting lands, and so on. It's only in 1998 that Sweden formally apologised to the Sami for the way Sweden had treated them. So when Pat Condell says it's now unconstitutional to uphold Swedish values in Sweden, that's only if Swedish values mean, which is what I presume Condell takes them to mean, overlooking the past and abuses against one of the indigenous peoples of Sweden, the Sami, who also spread into other places at the top of the world. That's a fairly big oversight there, not to even mention that. But, minor detail for Condell. And we move on to this thing about Sweden being the rape capital of Europe, and predictably enough, Condell blames it on Muslims. And he links in the description to a newspaper called The Local, thelocal.se. Now it's always worth checking out Condell's links, because he's come up with some really choice ones in the past. Let me quote from Condell's own link that he uses to say that the high incidence of rape in Sweden is because of Muslims. Quote, "The figures can, however, be somewhat distorted, as it is often only assault rapes by strangers and aggravated acquaintance rapes that are reported in many of these countries," that's comparator countries, "as was in the case in Sweden 40 years ago. The high incidence of rape in Sweden has a strong connection to nightlife and partying, specifically after club parties in private homes. Early sexual debuts, higher alcohol consumption, free sexuality, and the right to say no quite simply results in more rapes, the study concludes." End quote. Now, just to make clear, I'm not saying there aren't any problems associated with Islam or with immigration, but Condell is grossly oversimplifying things to the point of coming out with untruths. Next up, he talks about the Swedish newspaper Subsidy. How, I mean, this is almost New World Order stuff. Yes, Sweden subsidises newspapers. It's been doing it for years. Saying that they're, you know, it's to keep out any dissenting opinion. Well, they also get, you know, it was recently decided that the National Democrats newspaper, Nationalidad, should get a subsidy, like any other newspaper. Now, the subsidies are relatively large. It's 483 million crowns, which is 44 million pounds, $69 million, and 52 million euros, which goes to about 80 recipients. Nationalidad, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, gets 1.679 million crowns, which is 240,000 US dollars, 153,000 British pounds, or 183,000 euros. So it's getting money, despite the fact that this is the paper of the National Democrats. That they have no parliamentary representation, no European representation, no county representation. 3 municipalities is what they've got, and they're the usual third positionist nutters. You know, along with people like the BNP and so on. But they do actually go so far as to say on their website that they want to limit public exposure to degenerate art. Now, the next one, which I thought was hilarious from Condell, was that Sweden was on the way to becoming the first European Islamic state. I mean, usually he's banging on about Holland, but he's over 1,000 years out of date. The first European Islamic state, well, Al-Andalus would seem to be the obvious one, and then the successor Taifa kingdoms. But even if you want to look in the period after the Peace of Westphalia, Albania and Turkey would seem to be obvious contenders. Now, next up is something that is serious, I think. Anti-Semitism in Malmo. Now, I wouldn't, you know, I've looked into it a little bit, having seen Condell's video. It's serious. It's a problem. It is something that needs to be dealt with. The mayor of Malmo is someone by the name of Ilmar Reepalu, described by the Daily Telegraph as a left-wing mayor. He's a social democrat, and he seems to be a bit useless. Condell says as much, you know, and I think he's right. He didn't know what was going on in his own city. What he said was that Malmo should have neither Zionism nor anti-Semitism, which I think gives an idea of where he's coming from. But later said that he'd used Zionism wrongly. He shouldn't have said it. I just hope that Pat Condell notices the need for being careful about one's choice of words, particularly as Pat Condell said, yeah, it's all Muslims doing this, quoting again from the article to which Condell links to justify his position. Malmo's Jews, however, do not just point the finger at bigoted Muslims and their fellow racists in the country's neo-Nazi fringe. End quote. Now, you then have this bizarre thing at the end, saying statistically a Jew is thousands of times more likely to win a Nobel Prize than a Muslim, which is correct, if you look at it. But it's a perfect summation, I think, of the simplistic way in which Pat Condell looks at the world, finds his story and then goes and looks for any evidence to support it rather than the other way around, even to the point of, it seems, not even reading his own sources. Because I'm sure if you go through, a man is, many times more likely to win a Nobel Prize than a woman. Perhaps the other social, economic, cultural effects are, need to be considered as well. Yes, religion needs to be considered. Perhaps, as I've said previously, there are particular features of Islam, but maybe, just maybe, there are other things as well that need to be considered. So that's, I have to say, quite a remarkable video from Condell. He ignored. He said that change the constitution without consulting the people, not caring or finding out that that's not how the constitution's changed in Sweden. Says it's recognising multiculturalism, and then tries, either tries to pretend or isn't aware of the fact that Sweden is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual state, regardless of immigration. Calls Sweden the rape capital of Europe and blames it on Muslims when his own source disagrees with him. Doesn't get it right with the Swedish newspaper Subsidy, saying that there's this big conspiracy by the government when the government will fund newspapers that clearly disagree with the government line. Comes out with this nonsense about the first European Islamic state. He's like I said, a few centuries out of date there. And then has this stuff about, Jews being more likely to win the Nobel Prize than Muslims, saying it must only be about Islam and can't possibly be about anything else. It's a bizarre, conspiratorial way of looking at the world. I hope he will take the lesson from Ilmar Reepalu and realise that you do actually sometimes have to choose your words a little bit more carefully than that, because otherwise people are going to look into it and find out that you're speaking a load of rot. I'm Landon Cole. I'll see you next time.